Hello, I'm Lafferty. I'm Legal Director at Disability Law and Advocacy Center in Tennessee. DLAC is a private nonprofit agency, and we work to end discrimination and protect the rights of people with disabilities. We're Tennessee's federally mandated protection and advocacy system. We provide legal services across the entire state of Tennessee, so I'm going to be talking about statewide issues today, not just those in Nashville. Our agency focuses on issues that fall in three major areas: freedom from harm, freedom from discrimination, and freedom to participate in the community. During our previous fiscal year, 2013, we were contacted by 2,367 individuals seeking help or information referrals about disability-related issues. We provided information referral to 1,972 of those people. We opened cases to directly assist 395 clients with disabilities. A majority of our cases fall in the area of disability discrimination. So that's why I'm here today to talk to you about discrimination against Tennesseans with disabilities. What is a disability? The definition I'm going to use today is from the Americans with Disabilities Act. The ADA defines disability as a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. A few examples of major life activities are walking, seeing, hearing, talking, and thinking. So the ADA definition is fairly broad. Given that, it's not surprising that there are 57 million people with disabilities in the United States, and that's an approximate number. I think there are probably more. There are approximately 1 million people with disabilities in Tennessee. People with disabilities are the largest minority in our state and in our country. As some of the other speakers have spoken about, freedom from discrimination is a human right. It's a human right of everybody, including people with disabilities. For people with disabilities, there are also laws that protect the right to be free from discrimination. The Americans with Disabilities Act, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, the Federal Fair Housing Act, the Tennessee Human Rights Act, the Tennessee Disability Act, and other similar laws. Like other types of discrimination, disability discrimination hurts our entire society, not just people with disabilities. Discrimination stigmatizes and limits people with disabilities. Discrimination removes the opportunity for society to fully benefit from participation and contributions of people with disabilities. It's impossible for a person with disability to enrich a company, an apartment complex, a business service, or a government program if they cannot even get in the door or are turned away after they get in. One of the first steps in addressing disability discrimination must be to help others understand the damaging impact that discrimination has on everyone. We can do that by regularly including disability when discussing civil rights issues, and that's why I'm glad disability is part of this forum today. We can do that by using people-first language when talking about people with disabilities. So people with disabilities, not the disabled, not the handicapped, people with mental illness, not the mentally ill, respectful language. We can address disability discrimination by making sure that people with disabilities are not only empowered to advocate for themselves, but also know where to look for help on the occasions that self-advocacy fails. This is a systemic problem, and we need to involve people with disabilities in solving it. Unfortunately, by and large, Tennessee is not known for being a leader on disability rights issues. In fact, it's more often the case that our state is an example of what not to do when serving people with disabilities. It was not that long ago that we were known as the state that made people with disabilities crawl to court. One of our clients was forced to crawl up steps to attend his court hearing. Another, who is a court reporter, was repeatedly carried upstairs in her wheelchair in order to just do her job. Since people with disabilities should have meaningful access to the court program, I was able to work with co-counsel to represent these two clients and 4 other people with mobility disabilities. That case was called Lane versus Tennessee. It was against the state of Tennessee and 25 Tennessee counties, and was resolved by entry of historic settlement agreements that required widespread changes. As a result of those settlements, the majority of those counties have made physical changes to their courthouses. The others have made program changes. As helpful as all those changes have been, the change that's had the most impact on people with disabilities across the state, and these are people with mobility disabilities and other kinds of disabilities, The biggest change has been the development of the Tennessee Judicial Branch ADA policy. Thanks to that policy and related procedures and forms, our state is now a model for other states on the issue of access to justice for people with disabilities. And yet, people who are deaf regularly experience refusals and delays when they request that our courts provide sign language interpreters. So we've come a long way, but we're not where we need to be yet. Given the prevalence of disability discrimination in Tennessee and the number of calls we get every year at DLAC, I can't share all the details with you today, but I'm going to highlight the primary kinds of disability discrimination that we see. People with disabilities who use service dogs are routinely turned away from multiple businesses or told to leave their dogs at home in order to participate in programs and services of the businesses. This is happening at hotels, restaurants, medical offices, homeless shelters, and private housing providers. This barrier is being encountered by people with different types of disabilities, including those who are blind, those who have mobility disabilities, and those who have mental illness. People who are deaf are experiencing communication discrimination in multiple settings. Many doctors and hospitals across Tennessee routinely fail to provide sign language interpreters to deaf patients and deaf family members. This is happening even when those medical providers are trying to discuss complex and lengthy information, including medical history, diagnosis, prognosis, and medical tests. People who are deaf are also experiencing problems making phone calls to businesses and government agencies across our state. People who are deaf make phone calls by using something called a relay service, and some businesses and government programs simply won't accept those calls. People who are deaf and hard of hearing are even having difficulty accessing public information in our state. Currently, our General Assembly hearings and sessions are televised and internet streamed. However, they are not closed captioned for people with hearing disabilities. Colleges are failing to provide accessible materials to students with disabilities. This particularly impacts those with disabilities impacting learning and communication. People who are blind and have vision disabilities are often the most affected. And it's particularly the case regarding electronic educational materials. So electronics and digital media is helping overall across the country, but new barriers are arising for people with disabilities. People with disabilities impacting mobility often experience difficulty finding accessible parking. Some businesses don't provide accessible parking at all. Those that do often do not provide a sufficient number of spaces, or they provide spaces that say they're accessible but really aren't because they're not wide enough or they don't have access aisles. It doesn't do much good to park if you don't have a place to put down your ramp so that you can actually get out of your vehicle or put down your lift. People with mobility disabilities regularly experience architectural barriers which prevent them from entering businesses, using restrooms once they get in, and accessing government programs, including polling places. Lack of ramps, elevators, widened doorways, and the simple failure to move programs to accessible locations are keeping people with mobility disabilities from moving freely about Tennessee and from enjoying business and government programs and services. People with disabilities also routinely experience employment discrimination due to their disability. This creates barriers to obtaining and maintaining employment. Despite being the largest minority in the United States, people with disabilities are the most underemployed. Believe it or not, only 28% of Tennesseans with disabilities are employed. Most of the employment discrimination results from employers refusing to make reasonable accommodations, reasonable changes necessary due to disability. Things like providing sign language interpreters or other communication aids, allowing a job coach, providing rest breaks, or time off for medical appointments. Obviously, I went down a quick list, and these are only examples of the many kinds of disability discrimination we're seeing in Tennessee. When people with disabilities experience discrimination, there are several possible ways to address that discrimination. Our agency, Disability Law and Advocacy Center, typically helps clients informally resolve these issues by negotiating with adversaries. Informal resolution tends to get to a quicker result and also a better result than some of the other options. But sometimes it's not appropriate and sometimes it doesn't work. So what do we do then? There are administrative remedies available from federal agencies. There are there are court remedies available from federal and state courts. All of those things take a long time, years at times, to resolve the issues. And so, as much as we want to try to help people and get their issues resolved, filing with federal and state agencies and courts often cause delays. I'm pleased to say that the Tennessee Human Rights Commission is to some degree a shining star among that whole array of delay. When we file housing discrimination complaints for people with disabilities with THRC, those are processed timely. When we file disability discrimination complaints about employment that is direct discrimination, those are processed timely. So we would love to be able to file more things with the Tennessee Human Rights Commission. Unfortunately, right now, THRC does not have jurisdiction over discrimination in private businesses due to disability or discrimination in government settings due to disability. They also don't have jurisdiction over employment complaints, employment discrimination based on failure to grant reasonable accommodations. And those are most of the employment discrimination cases that we see. So we would love it if THRC's jurisdiction was expanded to address these things. That would give us and other people with disabilities also who are not our clients just another way to potentially address discrimination. Through our agency's work, helping with all these many disability rights issues, we've learned that most cases of disability discrimination are not due to bad intent or evil people. They are due to people not understanding people with disabilities and not understanding disability rights. So the biggest barrier to addressing disability rights in Tennessee is the lack of widespread education and training about these issues. DLAC and our collaborators work as hard as we can to address these issues, but we can't reach everybody who needs to learn about them. So we welcome the opportunity to work with the Tennessee Human Rights Commission and other stakeholders to educate government entities, businesses, housing providers, employers, and members of the public about people with disabilities and their civil rights. Let's work together to send the clear message that Tennessee will no longer tolerate disability discrimination. Thank you.